Good morning, my brothers and sisters. Welcome to episode number 32 in the book of 1 Peter. We're in chapter 5. We're near the end. Yesterday we talked about that we are living in a hostile, rich environment, and that is a hostile, real environment. We're being prowled upon and pursued, and we need to act like it. We need to act like we live in the Serengeti of the spiritual world rather than in the suburbs of the spiritual world. And remember that we are prey, but we also have a protector. Okay, so today we're going to go back to suffering. That is spiritual suffering. So we are called to be sufferers. It says it all the way through 1 Peter. You just can't get away from it. So we're supposed to be good stewards in the suffering with our hearts and our attitudes. We're supposed to know that it is temporary, that it's for God's glory, that He's in it, that He's sovereign. So we're also supposed to be stewards of the suffering and of the suffering itself. That's the big point that I'm going to get to here today. So we're talking primarily about spiritual suffering. It could be physical suffering, but it could be also suffering in temptation. It's suffering that God sovereignly allows. So He's in this whole thing. He sees it. He's exampled it Himself. He's sovereign. And today we find out that it's going to be short term, that there's an after to suffering. All right, so I have 8 points today. Many of them are review, but I want to get to the 8th one here today. So number 1, don't be surprised by suffering. We're supposed to understand that suffering exists and that we're supposed to be dealing with it, even embracing it. It comes to everybody. If you define suffering as resisting temptation, I guarantee that it'll come to you this morning, and another dose in the afternoon, and another one in the evening. Secondly, is be sharing in Christ's suffering. So He had the same temptations. He had the opportunities for the same response. We are supposed to be tracing over the footsteps that He has drawn out for us and using Him as an example. So number 3 is not only using the example of Christ, but be the same in suffering from the brotherhood. So it says here today, so here's the passage for today, the new concept. This is from 1 Peter chapter 5, 2 verses here today. Verse 8, be sober-minded, be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. Resist him firm in your faith, knowing that the same kinds of suffering are being experienced by your brotherhood throughout the world. That's verse 9. And then verse 10, here's the temporary part. And after you have suffered a little while, the God of all grace, who has called you to His eternal glory in Christ, will Himself restore, confirm, strengthen, and establish you. So not only do we have the example of Christ, we talked about that before, today we find out here that it's the same suffering that our brothers and sisters all throughout the world are experiencing today. So we're not alone. We experience it alone, but we're not alone in our suffering. Number 4, be steadfast. Like I said, you will be tempted today, and you're going to have the opportunity to do the right thing today in your suffering. Number 5, the sovereignty of God. Be sovereign in your suffering. God is still on the throne. In fact, we're going to find out later here that we're actually called to this. Number 6, be short-term in your suffering. So one of the big points today is that there is an after to suffering. Verse 9. Verse 10, after you've suffered a while, the God of all grace, who's called you to His eternal glory in Christ Jesus, will Himself restore, confirm, strengthen, and establish you. So there's an after to this suffering. He's going to restore us, and He's going to mend us to the point of that restoring. He's going to confirm and strengthen. He's going to make us strong. He's going to make us able. And we get to experience in a special way His grace. All right, number 7 is be a good steward in suffering. So this is what the nuclear power plant of 1 Peter in chapter 2 talked about, of entrusting, being careful, being a good steward of our words during suffering, and good steward of our attitude. And the final point for today, and this is the big one for today, is be a good steward of suffering, of suffering itself. So it's almost as if suffering can be a gift to you. It can be a test to you. It can be an opportunity for you, a tool, if you will, to do the spiritual right, do the spiritual life correctly. So being a good steward of the suffering itself, almost, I know this sounds just crazy to say, but almost have it be a treasure. So in conclusion today, what are you suffering about? What are you in pain about? Maybe it's a who. Maybe who are you in pain about? Or what has befallen you that you didn't cause? In 1 Peter, suffering is kind of in two categories: as just suffering. That is something you put upon yourself. You know, you robbed a bank, so you have to go to jail, and you don't like jail very much. But then there's the suffering that you didn't cause. The quote-unquote unjust suffering, something you didn't deserve. So we ask, how has the effects of evil or maybe the fall visited you? Is it a difficulty? Is it a death or a sickness or a relational pain? Perhaps it's a limitation. Maybe it's a hardship. Maybe it's the sweat of your brow in earning a living. Or for the vast majority of people, is it enduring a temptation? Is it resisting a temptation? Resisting temptation will be suffering. As soon as you give in to the temptation, the suffering stops. So we are called to suffer, and to today be a good steward during it, and being a good steward almost of it itself. So today, be resisting of temptation. My prediction is you will suffer today. It's an opportunity to resist. So the call today is to be a good steward of the suffering that God has allowed for you. Thanks for listening.